Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and today is part 3 of 3, East and Southeast Asian Lager Taste Test Final Elimination Round. This is a continuation video, so if you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 already, links are down below. But just to give you a quick recap, basically what we did was take 20 different lagers from East and Southeast Asian nations, Japan, South Korea, China, Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore, and we pitted them all against each other, ranking them sort of into brackets of kind of good, medium, not so good, with kind of a little bit of a variance between those sections. And then the top 7 beers were selected as finalists at the end of episode 2. So those 7 beers, I am now going to be trying and ranking those in real time against one another to see which of them, at least in my honest opinion, is best. So let's get to the tasting and see which beer comes out on top. Starting off, we have Cloud, not made with additives such as rice or cornstarch. It's just the basic, classic ingredients. Yep, classic lager color. That's a perfectly good, clean, crisp, refreshing beer. Cloud is another one of these beers where, like for a lot of East Asian lagers, there's some almost imperceptible taste to it that marks it out as being not something you get from a European beer. And I can't put my finger on what it is, but I've described it sometimes as sharp in the case of Sapporo, but it's a flavor that I don't associate with Western lagers. And Cloud definitely has that. It's also got a nice full body, so there's nothing in the lager that feels kind of like watery or thin. It's, well balanced, good bit of crispness, bit of malt, a little bit of hops, and just that sort of imperceptible sharpness. Perfectly enjoyable drink, perfectly clean. I would say exceptionally bold in any one sense. It's more just kind of an all-around balanced beer that kind of leans a little bit towards the side of lighter and crisper. So continuing on, let's go with Sapporo. Okay. Very thin head on this one as well. Perfectly fine lager, perfectly acceptable. It has even more of that sharpness, and Sapporo I even referred to in the original video back in season 1 as being kind of the beer, I think, that for me, I associated that sharp flavor with East Asian lagers, which in hindsight, I realize I may have just been associating a flavor that I characterize as being part of Sapporo. Perfectly fine beer. It's relative to Cloud, though, a little bit less carbonated, I would say, in some ways. I don't want to describe it as still because clearly there's some carbonation, but if you notice, there's not that much of a head on Sapporo, so the beer, I think, is a little bit less carbonated. It has a little bit more of a stillness to it, but it's a little bit more one note than the Cloud. The sharpness is what I get on this, and the body is fine. A little more thin, I think, compared to this one. In comparison, it's not quite as overall enjoyable. Which one will be next? How about Tsingtao? Yeah, a little bit of a head. There are these very unique characters of East Asian lagers that are so specific that they don't show up in the lagers of other parts of the world. And there are these, just notes in Tsingtao and in Cloud and in Sapporo, all 3 of them actually, that are very particular. I like that unique aspect of them. It has the clean sharpness of Sapporo, but it has a better body. The body is a little bit more full, is a more enjoyable drinking experience than the Sapporo, which is a little bit just, it's sharp, but the body below it is not quite as nice. So don't know quite about relative to Cloud, but definitely this is what we got so far. So next up, we have Asahi. Nice fluffy head on that. I really like the way that this beer is brewed. I like how light and airy and dry, but not hoppy. So this beer does not have the same sharpness to it that these do. But I still really just like that light karakuchi flavor of Asahi. There's something about just the lightness and the pleasant dryness, the unique flavor of Asahi that just really works for me. And it's specific enough that it, I think, sets it apart from kind of other beers. Even if they're good quality, it gets points for originality, you could say. Next up, Singan. Season head. What I really like about this beer is the fact that it just has bright, spicy beer. In the sense that it's not literally spicy. It's not like you've got the actual heat that you'd have from sort of spicy food. And it's not dry. It's not like it's a dry hoppiness or anything like that, or a bitterness. It's just a fun experience in terms of the sensation that's still kind of left on the palate after you drink it. You just kind of have this like, wow, that's a very bright beer, where it's not tangy and it's not citrusy flavored. If the beer were using some type of hops or some type of mash where you're still getting a bright kind of strong flavor from grain or from sort of plant-based material that's, not so much fruit. Anyway, so this is working for me. Down to our last two. Next we have San Miguel Pale Pilsen. Similar to all the rest. San Miguel Pale Pilsen has this wonderful tropical brown sugary sweetness to it. It is like no other lager that I've had in that regard. The thing for me is that the sweetness is very nice, but I don't know how great it would be if I had more than one of these. So finally, beer number 7 is Sapporo Reserve. This one is a little bit, or should we say maybe a lot of it, harder to find than Sapporo Premium, Sapporo sort of regular. And this has a very nice, full, sort of good-bodied lager character, and it leans much heavier on the malt. It almost reminds me of the Asahi in some ways. It's like a more full-bodied and richer version of the Asahi, but there are still those dry notes that aren't hoppy, and there's not quite the sharpness to this. There's a little hint of the sharpness. You know what I'm gonna do. All right, now, this is what I have right now for sort of gut feeling. So this might switch up a little bit, but let's see what happens in the assessment for the final conclusion as to which is in last place, which is in first place, and which maybe end up in tied position. So in the final assessment, I switched Cloud and Tsingtao. In last place is Sapporo Premium. This beer is a perfectly fine Japanese lager, but relative to the others loses points because of the fact that it has, I think, a little bit of a thin body. There's a sharp note to it, which is quite interesting and unique, but that's sitting on top of sort of a base that I don't think is as interesting as these other beers. So it's not overall, I think, as well put together, shall we say, but it's still a perfectly fine beer. Works perfectly well with kind of many Japanese foods. And I think, and I will give it credit for the fact that I think relative to the other Japanese beers at least, it's, I think, the most versatile where it can deal with kind of heavier flavors. Next is San Miguel. While I do quite enjoy this beer and I really love the sort of sweet, kind of subtly brown sugar flavor in it, that's at least how I describe it, I'm ranking it down here for the fact that if I were to have more than one of these, if I were to have, let's say, 2 with friends or with a meal, I don't know if the sweetness would really work after just one of these. And so in that sense, just thinking about kind of how much I would want to come back to that flavor, still quite a nice beer, very nice, unique flavor, but loses some points in terms of what I would want to come back to. Next is Cloud. This is, of all the beers here, this is the most sort of, dare I say, standard, vaguely European-esque of them, while still having a little bit of that sort of subtly sharp kind of character or sort of fresh character one would associate with East Asian lagers. It's of the 7, it's the one with the least obvious sort of discernible profile, the one that falls in the closest category to, as I describe it, beer that just tastes like beer. For beer that tastes like beer, all of the components, the kind of the maltiness, a little bit of hoppiness, a little bit of that kind of fresh sharpness, and a reasonably acceptable body are all blended perfectly fine together, but there's nothing I would say, rather unique about it that stands out in a pleasant way compared to these other. It's simply a well-crafted lager beer. Moving into these final four, I do have them placed next to each other, suggesting that they are, in my honest opinion, all beers that deserve to be in the kind of the top category, and in which I think we start getting into the world of beers that you might rank differently depending on what you prefer in regards to specific unique flavors. Tsingtao for me is a beer that kind of fresh flavor that I associate with Chinese lagers. Tsingtao, I think, does that very well, and it makes it just sort of an enjoyable beer to drink, especially honestly, with Chinese food. This would be just a perfect complement to sort of flavors that can range from sweet and sour to maybe slightly umami, obviously a Japanese term, but nonetheless, you still have that, to spicy food and food that's maybe a little bit heavier. Maybe not quite so much rice-based dishes, but rice-based dishes, especially anything that involves soy, sesame, stuff like that. It's a very versatile beer in that sense, and I really like the flavor combination while still being sort of just a kind of an easy to drink lager. Compared to these other four, I'm gonna rank Asahi Reserve a little bit higher just because I think the richness of the malty flavor in the Asahi Reserve and the fact that it has certain elements from, I'm gonna say the Asahi, the light sort of not hoppy dryness, like the smooth dryness, along with a little bit of that sharpness from the Asahi Premium, I quite like with this one. And I think the way that that's blended together is very, very enjoyable to drink. The Asahi though, honestly, the lightness, the airiness, the karakuchi, the smooth dryness, it's such a particular and unique drinking experience. And it's just a beer that I imagine pairing so well, assuming you're not going with sake, with those subtle, extremely sort of excellent flavors of Japanese food, whether it's sashimi, kaiseki, where you really, if you're gonna have a beer, you want something that on its own is a very enjoyable drinking experience, but it's going to not get in the way of food that you're consuming, and it's gonna be an excellent pairing with subtle flavors. And the fact that this itself has a very soft, subtle mix of flavors for a lager, I've got to give it a lot of points. But, and this is just my personal assessment, number one, or should we say tied for number one along with three other beers, I have to give it to Singha. And the thing about Singha that just does it for me is the bright, just exciting flavors that I get in the palate. There's not another beer, or certainly another lager beer that I can think of that has such a unique characteristic in terms of the grain version of spiciness, in the sense that when you have spicy food, right, it's exciting, it's bright, it's light, but it's also strong, depending on what kind of spiciness you're having, right? It's the grain version of spiciness, which I think it's such an interesting flavor combination, where it's using the same components of these other beers. There's something about it, and I think it's the hops, that creates I almost want to describe it as like fizzy sort of sparklingness. And for me, that just works really well. And I think of all of these, it's one, maybe along with Tsingtao, that would pair the best with spicy food. So if I were to think, what beer would I pick if I were to pair this with, let's say, food that's not from the nation from which this beer originates, I would go with these three. These four, I think, have flavor profiles that I think would work very well with the foods one would associate with the nations from which these beers originate. So anyway, that's my assessment. I hope you enjoyed. If you found this interesting, let me know in the comments. As always, just keep it, polite, respectful to your fellow internet denizens. If you want to go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, it really does make a big difference in terms of us being able to make new content in the coming weeks, coming months. It also only takes about 5 seconds or so, maybe not even. I hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next video.